All right, very good.
Okay.
Hello.
Here we
Sounds
are.
good.
So, you're so clear, concise. It's
Sultry.
beautiful. Oh, ooh.
You guys are buttering me up already.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
that's why we have to be as friendly as humanly possible at the start so that eventually you will divulge your secrets.
Yeah. It's like Howard Stern.
exactly.
Yeah. We present a friendly attitude just so that you can
Yeah.
reveal your deep, dark secrets on the podcast.
We play music, let you make fun of people, and then eventually we'll be like, so, I mean, rehab. Like, really give us
And where were you on 9/11? Nobody knows.
Yeah.
Can you give us more details?
That is actually an interesting question. I think you're old enough to know. Where were you on 9/11?
Are we recording right now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Wow.
We've been recording for a little while.
We don't do any like hot intro. We just sort of cold open and
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard. Actually, Cal Newport talks about the art of podcasting, and he talks about when he went on with the famous podcaster. What's his name?
Joe Rogan.
Yeah, that's right, Joe Rogan.
Yeah, yeah.
That was a pop quiz right there.
yeah.
Good job, you.
Have we established our bona fides?
Yeah.
And he
Perfect.
talks about his whole technique, how he has his whole studio set up and he's walking in and then he starts recording before anybody actually knows. So maybe you're taking tips from him.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, it's also the popular thing not to have intros now.
Yeah.
It's the
okay.
new,
It's the
it's the new
aesthetic thing,
hotness because hopping in with being like, well, hey, Shadrach Strehle here, and welcome to Monomaniacs, blah blah blah. You know, this is our guest, Harry Potter. I
It's
don't know.
obnoxious. Is that what it is or what?
Well,
the way he was saying
yeah.
it.
That's all I
that-
was hearing.
Yeah. What's
Yeah.
the? I don't know. What is it? Was it a fallacy when you just like say the argument that your opponent just said, but in a funny voice? Like,
Ad
oh, yeah,
hominem.
Oppenheimer was a good movie. There is no argument that could break
I
that.
thought that was just called pulling a Rowan.
yeah.
True.
Pulling a Rowan. You know, the funny thing, we talk about this a lot on the show, but I think you'll especially appreciate it. But the only show we've ever received substantial complaint about was the episode with Nick Rowan.
Was it really?
Yeah.
And why is that?
Because he, his whole gimmick was that he decided what really was America.
Oh.
And he just
Yeah.
sort of just said it was New England, basically, where
Yeah,
he's like, yeah, America stops once you hit Minnesota or whatever. I don't know. It got very, it was one of his things. He was holding forth in a Rowan way,
Yeah.
where, the sort of thing where he'll just say, I think Hootie and the Blowfish really were onto something, something like that. Except for it was about what America was. And then people took it seriously. And so I'd get, we got like DMs where I'd run into an old friend and he'd be like, hey man, like that guy was whack. You really gotta pull him in line.
We can't platform that guy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's incredible that he's a journalist.
Yeah. Well,
Still make it happen, dude. I mean, what is journalism if not having the spiciest takes and then sort of writing that way
Nowadays.
consistently?
nowadays, certainly.
Oh,
Nowadays,
I don't
certainly. I mean, it must be nice to be out of the media as a discipline.
I don't know that it ever was. There
know.
was a brief stint in which I kind of delusionally thought I had hopes that I could write screenplays and start directing films.
know.
Yeah.
And then it turned out I was incapable of writing screenplays. Or at least this has been my fear of going on podcasts too. Is I'm one of these people where I think there's a lot of people who have an initial hump or a phase when they start doing something and it's unbearable to hear your own work. I always
Yeah.
had the experience, especially when I was younger. I think everybody has this of opening up your journal from a couple years ago and being so horrified at. For me, it's the spelling. It always is the spelling. It's still a problem. I'm so grateful for autocorrect. But then,
Yeah.
it was certainly that experience with the screenplays. Is I feel myself trying to write something and I don't know where to begin and it's not coming. And then I read it and I want to destroy it. And I've
Yeah.
never gotten past that phase. And I don't know if I can.
Yeah. The funny thing about that is that when you're young, it's more of a year-to-year thing. But the older you get, it's almost a day-to-day thing, right? Where I'll read something I wrote yesterday, and I don't know. I go through phases where I have very disciplined writing schedules,
Yeah.
and my wife has sort of gotten used to me, typing away because I write on either like a screenless writing assistant tool. I don't know if have you ever seen these things where it's like it looks like a big calculator, but you type in it.
Yes. No, I have one.
Yeah. Like a free write or what kind?
The free write's way too expensive.
Yeah, no, exactly.
I got the old school.
Yes, I think we might have the same thing.
Yes, we
What's
probably
what's
do.
the model called?
rounded, It's rounded on top.
Yeah.
Yeah, those things are wonderful.
It's awesome. It's a very much a time saver and also
I was
screensaver.
talking to. I mean, they're kind of coming in, but the free rights are too expensive.
yeah.
But it's something that has to be talked about in the media. At least I was talking to Dwight about this because
Yeah.
there has to be enough demand for it that someone will go and make one that's the right style.
I
Because
was-
there's no
Yeah.
competition for.
I was
free write
thinking
right now, and
about
it's
that.
it's still
too
high,
expensive.
and it's too high tech too because it
Yeah.
automatically downloads to
At the cloud.
on the
You have to
cloud.
have an
No, I
app.
don't want that.
Yeah,
No
well, and
way.
there's an added element too where they're kind of shoddily constructed.
Yes.
Like every review I've ever read says, well, you can't like breathe at it, right? Where it's something like with these puppies, what we're using, which it's a bummer that I can't remember what it is. It's some Japanese company, I think.
Yeah.
You can throw that thing at a wall.
It was, yeah, I know. It was actually designed by a former Apple employees. Did you know that?
Oh, really?
Yeah, I found out this recently that they were working with Apple in the 90s, and they figured out they wanted to do typewriters, like make something that would help kids in schools typing, but not typewriters because those were getting obsolete. And so they designed this product. And so there's elements you'll actually, if you notice, if you use Apple computers, that the cursor moves similar to a
really?
Mac.
Interesting.
And yeah, and it makes a lot of sense for me, the idea of the kind of simplicity, the removal of distractions. There's a lot of kind of Apple-esque elements.
Because I've done most of my writing in my life post-graduation on either that, which I got fairly recently, or on an actual typewriter. I like doing that. And not for like hipster reasons, but mostly because I don't want to look at my screen.
You say that, but what does the hipster say? That they say they do it because they don't want to look at their screen.
Exactly.
I don't know. That you can justify it any way you want, Chad. It's still a hipster
This
move.
is just a real long. I was in the middle of a story. This is a roundabout way of saying.
I just feel like now is the time to confront you about this. At the very least, you sitting on your.
We're doing that old cliche of turning the camera around.
Yeah. Wait, is that actually why you guys' positions have switched?
Exactly, Chad. We wanted to talk to you about something. This is an intervention.
Oh gosh, it's my ex-girlfriends are gonna be walking through the door now.
No. Do you have ex-girlfriends, Chad?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
All right, fine. Okay.
What is that supposed to mean, dude?
Just because I'm no Don Juan doesn't mean I haven't had an ex-girlfriend or two in my lifetime. Jeez.
Goodness. So I would like to hear the rest of your story.
We're just gonna say that my wife is used to me at this point, exclaiming loudly, ripping a piece of paper out of a typewriter and ripping it into shreds, or crumbling it up and throwing it in the trash. But the thing is that sometimes, distance will make the heart grow fonder. Where I've discovered every once in a while, what's up with these gnats? We have like gnats in here now,
dude.
Hey,
what do you have to say about the election?
This is a first podcast interview a gnat.
Guinness, reach out.
I should have been a cricket for how good that joke was.
I don't know. I think that joke was the cricket joke. Whatever.
Okay.
We don't
My bad. My bad.
You were saying something about the distance and the heart growing fonder.
I'm just every once in a while I will pick out a old thing that I've written in a pile and been like, there's some value there. So there's a place where you can be too quick to judge.
No, for me, it's actually turned into I learned my lessons so quickly and so hard about looking at my old writing that now when I go back, I'm braced and I assume it's going to be so bad. And so now my normal condition is actually going back and being surprised that it's good, which is nice.
Yeah.
It's nice.
So what kind of stuff were you interested in writing screenplays about?
Oh, goodness. I have a couple ideas. One that I'm particularly fond of is the idea of making a movie about a Josephite marriage.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I like movies about love. I mean, that's the best movies. And movies about relationships. And
when was the last time there was a Josephite marriage in America?
Well, Maritain would be the famous one, and he lived in America for a while. So he's the kind of premier show for Josephite.
For those that don't know,
like you.
Well, I mean,
no, he's going to explain
through context clues.
Yeah.
No, I'm not going to explain. For those that don't know, could one of you guys describe what it is?
Sam, you should. You're the one who's describing this.
I'm only just learning about Jacques Maritain, so I'm very behind in this, and someone's going to listen to it and say, you don't know anything. But that's all right. He was a Catholic intellectual who helped work with the UN after World War II, and he was a Thomist, but of a very distinct, unusual kind, because he was very modern. And so Thomists actually like him, as far as I know. But he's kind of his own school, his own school of being a Thomist, but very much not forming a school around it, very much bringing it into dialogue. And his wife was also extremely intelligent, and she was also an intellectual. And they were remarkable people, because when they met each other, they were both in the throes of a particular school of philosophy that reduced the world down to kind of logical principles. And so they decided that if this was all the world had to offer, they would kill themselves in a year. And so then they found an amazing professor who I think he wasn't Catholic actually, but he was Christian, I think. And then they decided. Then they had a conversion, yada yada. And then after 2 years of marriage, they decided they would not have sex.
That's what it means to have a Josephite marriage.
Yeah, people also use Joseph-like because it's like Joseph and Mary.
Mm,
And
yes.
so this
in the Catholic understanding.
And so I always thought it would be such an interesting thing, and is that, it's not something. It's something permitted in the Catholic Church, but there also seems, I think everybody instinctively and probably properly has a reaction that there has to be something wrong with the marriage if they're not having sex.
Well, it's very difficult to get one approved. And there's like a lot of stories of people trying and then being like, no.
Yeah, because I know that within the Catholic Church, it's very important that consummation does occur, right? For marriage to be viewed as
although
legitimate.
it doesn't have to. So like the classic canon law example would be if you're in a car with your spouse and you get married and you are in the limo on the way to the hotel
and you die
and you crash and your lower half gets blown off, you're still married.
Okay. But it's about intent then.
Partially, yes.
Partially intent.
Yes.
So
but
you're getting married with the intent of not consummating the marriage.
I'm curious actually how canonically that a Josephite marriage would work.
I have no idea. No idea.
You haven't got to canon law class yet?
No, not yet. Not yet.
I'm curious how that would be considered. But it is, I mean, Saint Teresa Little Flower, if I'm not mistaken, her parents tried to get a Josephite marriage.
Oh, really?
And they said no.
Interesting.
Yeah. That was
So anyway, I think that there's it just seems like it's rife with potential for drama and questions and it's so it's
comedy as well.
So yes, comedy and sadness and I don't know, all sorts of things. So that would be an interesting one. And then I stole this one from a friend, but the idea of a kind of a capitalist horror film that occurs in an Ikea where you have like mass produced items, and so somehow they're trying to track down one, but everything's the same, and it's all instead of these kind of artificial homes that are taking place. I don't know.
Well, so that's funny that you bring that up. There's a video game that's come out or is in development right now.
Dylan works in the industry.
I work in the industry. I work in the video game industry. So I have, what's the word I'm looking for? Authority on such matters.
Yes,
I don't know. Where you are trapped in a infinite Ikea. So it's like a survival game, say like Minecraft or anything else like that, where you're just like in a place without resources and you have to go and find things like food, like you have to go into food courts and steal meatballs and stuff like that. And it's an infinitely recurring Ikea. And so you have to like build shelter out of chairs, and build walls out of chairs to defend yourself against the mannequins that are coming to kill you. So the anxiety of being in an Ikea, I guess, is strong enough that others have also seen to tap into it. Yeah,
it's used very well in the movie 500 Days of Summer, actually, because they have this kind of fantasy of being further along in their relationship than they are, and they go to an Ikea to shop for items, and they're kind of like playing house in all of these artificially constructed houses, and like a random family shows up in one of the houses when they're like having a rather romantic scene. So it's already been done well, at least in one film.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me a lot of. It's similar to Piranesi. Have you read Piranesi before?
No, I haven't.
Really good book, but it's about a alternate dimension where it's an infinitely recurring architectural nightmare. So like the work of famous Italian draft artist Piranesi, where it's a journal from the perspective of somebody who's lost their memory and is stuck in this place where there's infinite hallways and statuaries and all these things, and he's sort of just trying to figure it out around himself, and then he slowly learns more about his past or how he got there. It's a very good book. It's very short. Would highly recommend it. It's by the woman, I forget her name off the top of my head, who wrote Doctor Strange and Mr. Norrell.
Oh, okay.
Which is a funny book because I've read most of it, not all of it, but its gimmick is it's a Regency novel, but with magic. And you would think, that sounds like the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But but it sounds like something in the vein of Pride and Prejudice with zombies or something where it's pulpy and kind of silly, but it's amazing. It's like a well-written, well put together work. So she's really good. I'm sorry for not knowing her name off the top of my head, but
it'll be in the notes of the
the schnotes. Show notes.
That's what they say now.
No, that's what they used to say back in like 2006.
Oh, really? On the podcast, they would say that.
On this podcast.
Yes.
The previous host of this podcast.
Yeah, it's kind of like a Dread Pirate Roberts situation where we inherit it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Didn't know
just
this.
After going, into 2-on-2 combat with the previous host.
Yeah.
I think it's an excellent premise.
Yeah.
The Monomaniacs.
Yeah. We're just trying to find Monomania wherever we can find it.
Mhm.
You were actually talking about
This is the first time the guest has actually segued super well into
that.
the description of what this podcast is about.
Yes.
Well, it's because I'm eager. I to my discredit, I haven't ever listened to any except for some people have shown me little clips here and there.
Yeah.
But when I heard, I was asleep this morning because I hadn't slept at all the previous night, and Vincent my friend woke me up at 9:30 and said, "Would you like to be on the show this evening?" And I had this immediate the reaction if someone says, "Do you want to walk up onto a stage?" You always say, "No, God, no." but then I had an almost immediate turn. I thought, "No, this is very apropos."
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a good subject for it. I can say it from an objective sense.
Okay.
It's
You're calling your shot.
I'm not saying no. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that I'll perform well. I'm just saying that, in fact, I'm very monomaniacal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's why I thought of you. I was like, oh, I know somebody who likes to focus on things. And funny thing that you mentioned earlier that also kind of segues is you mentioned sort of a nascent Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Of getting started, having a lot of ideas about a thing. And then the more that you research it, the more you kind of realize, I'm not so good at this, like writing and whatnot. And part of this is trying to hit people at the peak of the Dunning-Kruger effect where they think they know everything.
Oh, yes.
Or they have peak interest.
They have peak interest before they fully realize that.
Oh, I see. So you like to catch people like when they're in the blossom.
Yes, exactly. Now, this doesn't necessarily have to mean that's what you're doing today, which, now that you guys know what the show is about, I guess it's time.
Exactly.
Sam,
Let's go.
Dude.
Give it to us.
What is your monomaniacal obsession?
What is your
white
whale?
whale, dude? What are you into at the moment?
At the moment, well, I think that the most natural one for me is film,
Nice.
but it's not a recent one, and nor am I currently in the throes of it. But it's going to persist.
Yeah. Which is good. Yeah, I think that's the most healthy monomaniacal obsession. Well, maybe not. I mean, I guess you could be really in defeat and do that for years. So I mean, maybe it's not the healthiest, but with a hobby and such, I think that if you pass the 1.5 year mark and you still at least reoccurringly, like at least once every 4 months or so, are really into that thing again.
Yeah.
I think it shows that you have more than just a passing interest in it.
Yes.
But,
So, are you interested in the history of it, or
Tell us about how you got into this.
I mean, mostly just like what interests you about it. Why are you into it?
Why are you excited? We want to know why you're excited, because if you're excited about it, maybe we'll be excited about it too.
For the listeners, those that are not watching the feed, he is shaking with excitement right now. He is just
trembling,
bouncing off the walls at the moment.
Why am I excited about film? Well, I think maybe the easiest way in would be how I discovered it. So I was like a normal film watcher for most of my childhood, all the way up into high school, and then I came under the influence. I don't know what the exact term is.
Sway.
There was a very handsome Colombian man who was 10 years older than me, who had been an artist. He had gone to a state school, but he had gone to a monastery for the past couple of years, so there was a whole mystique. I'd heard about him around, and then he came home, and getting to know him, he was in the art. He was going to the art institute as well, and he had made some films, and he introduced me to a different way of seeing them. And he and his brother started talking about movies, and I was immediately fascinated by this is. Sorry, I lost the direction of the microphone.
No, you're okay.
Movies are not. I'll say it this way: with some art forms like reading, it's very natural to have a give and take inside of the medium, because even the process of reading a book requires you to actively engage yourself. Once your eyes stop moving across the page, the words stop coming in, which is perhaps why we like Audible so much, is because it takes away the effort of it just keeps on moving forward, right? But with reading, the actual activity, it forces us to kind of engage. And even going and watching a play, if you have to go out and sit down and you enter into a kind of space. But with movies, I think maybe it's the danger of it. It is the danger of it. that you just turn it on and it comes at you and you experience it, and then you go away. And that's I think how very much how shows work. But the way that they were describing it was a much more active engagement in the movie, and something to be thought about. And so that got me very excited about it.
So in what ways what was the separation there? What did they mean by the conversation? Like, how do you engage in that conversation with a movie?
Is it more just active watching, right? Like, trying to discern meaning from it as opposed to just accepting the meaning in front of you? Okay.
I think that it's learning how starting to paying attention to how the camera moves, how the director's framing shots, and then a lot of it is just talking about movies afterwards. I think I think you start naturally trying to pick up on whatever it is that the film's trying to do, however they're working with you. They get you involved.
Yeah, that is interesting, because I think that as you sort of hit on, a lot of while you're watching a film is sort of you can be active in doing so, but it is inherently passive, as you mentioned. But the way you discuss it afterwards can sort of make up for that passivity during the viewing experience.
How's that unique to film, though?
Yeah, I don't know that particular element is unique. I think along with that, it was also the kind of privileged way that film can let you into other worlds, and so it was getting to starting to watch. We would start watching 30s or 40s Japanese black and white films.
Yeah,
and you read histories. There's all sorts of ways of engaging with that world, but there's something much more immediate where you have even the texture of the film and the characters and the action, the whole thing.
Yeah.
That suddenly you get a very immediate experience of a whole different way of looking at, engaging with the world.
Yeah, especially when it comes to the performances.
Yes,
as an added element, especially something that movies from that era have, where there's this weird rawness to the performance. I'm curious. One thing we've talked about movies a bit on the show with some other folks, and one thing we talk about a lot, and I'm curious if what you have to say about this, is that movies, sort of like drama in some ways, are a very collaborative art form, right? But at the same time, we just sort of default to what was the director saying, right? Even if they're not the screenwriter, even if they're not the person who wrote the score, right? We kind of default to that. Do you think that's a effective way to interface with film as a medium? To be focusing on the auteur, the person behind the camera, or should we be thinking about it more as a collaborative thing? Something that's more zeitgeist related than it is individual art.
I think that's an excellent question.
Yeah,
and I think it's a really interesting question, because it's something that comes up with. I think directors will talk about this a lot too. People talk about it because the term auteur it's French, right? And that's because the French directors during the French New Wave, like a 60s movement in film, wanted to create that kind of mystique around film because it didn't exist before. People were not very conscious in the early Hollywood days of directors. Maybe there were a couple standouts. Alfred Hitchcock, right? I mean, people know the Hitchcock films, right? John Ford. Yeah. But it was much less so. It was much more individual films were really good, and much more interest in the actors. And so it's only become later now that there's this whole mystique around the director.
Was that a sense of self-aggrandizement, or was that a sense of attempting to legitimize the art form?
Yeah, that's a great question too. It's because it's interesting, because you would think most of those guys became directors, but they were actually, almost all of them were critics beforehand, and none of them were directors. One of them started to make films later on, and then they started the French New Wave. But they were actually, it was them as journalists who were writing about it, who developed this kind of terminology around the director. And then they started doing it. So it wasn't self-aggrandizement when they came up with the terminology, because they weren't making movies.
Yeah. They just thought it was a more effective, critical way to view.
Yes, I think that they were watching movies, and they were interested in a very kind of French way about what the ideas going on in the movie, what they were communicating, a type of world. Like someone would discuss like Dante's image of the world. They were interested in how a particular director was presenting the world and their development.
That's interesting, especially when you factor in cinematographers and directors of photography.
Yeah,
and
the directors of photography get still to this day. They're very. You really need to know a true cinephile who knows who the cinematographer was. It matters, but
well, so that's where it's odd, because even especially in higher budget films. So, I mean, you can't really view them in the same way as like the French New Wave, but
No.
the abstraction gets further and further, right? Between the director and the thing, right? The funny thing is, though, is that you can still sort of see their fingerprints everywhere. Like every time I see a Denis Villeneuve film, like I know I'm seeing a Denis Villeneuve film, right? You know, from Enemy to Blade Runner 2049, there's like this consistency there.
But I mean, I think it really comes down to, you know, with like, say, to take television, right? The showrunner, you know, that being kind of like the director, their DNA is present throughout the entire process, right? Because they were involved in the selection of that cinematographer. They were involved in the direction that led to the score that was created, right? I mean, so was probably the executive producer, but like the way that sort of combines, you know, that DNA continues. I mean, Quentin Tarantino had the same editor for most of his career up until recently when she passed away. And I think it's that you could argue that, you know, they are, of course, a central part of that image, but it's sort of attached to the director because they are the decision maker that led to that person.
There's a funny, I'm not going to, I want you to keep talking. Of course, I'm not trying to Bogart this conversation, but there's this funny
film reference.
Yeah.
Humphrey Bogart.
Yeah.
I like that. I appreciate that.
Yeah. There is this added element of abstraction when you talk about score specifically, because now a lot of the famous composers have shops and they don't touch any of the music. They just hit final approval on it. So Hans Zimmer doesn't actually develop most of his soundtracks. You know, John Williams definitely doesn't actually, you know, like sit down and really write all of his stuff. You know, he will do some suggestions and whatnot, but he has a stable of people who does it. So then that's like an extra level of abstraction where it's like, okay, well, this isn't even the person. This is somebody imitating the person. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting thing. A lot of people don't realize that, where it's like, oh, yeah, this is a Hans Zimmer thing. It's like, well, it's somebody pretending to be Hans Zimmer. And he's really good at pretending in interviews that it's him. So I don't know.
Hey,
I think he did Dune, though. I have it on good authority. He did Dune.
Only because you like his interview that he did. Have you told Sam about this?
Have you heard of this interview?
I did.
Did you like Dune? I like Dune a lot. It's more of a blockbuster kind of movie.
I like blockbusters.
Yeah. But I really like Denis Villeneuve. So, and I like Dune a lot. So I like the movie. But there's this interview where he is talking specifically about how he loves the thing, and he told the director, like, you cannot screw this up. This is the most important thing in the world to me. If you're going to do if you're going out to film this movie, if you screw up Dune, I'm going to lose my mind, and I'm going to take I'm taking the music away if you really mess this up. So maybe he wrote.
And then also one of the songs is called Worm Boy.
One of the songs is called Worm Boy.
So that's pretty cool.
That's pretty cool.
But
anyway, so sorry.
No. Yeah. So to go back to the initial question, how valid is it to, like, how valid or how appropriate is it to really to look at films like there's a sea of films, and to see it in terms of groupings, in terms of director, rather than in terms of genre or era, or, you know, what any other number of types of ways that you could group them. I'm completely a believer in that way of viewing movies, and not discrediting the fact that I think it's all the more, in fact, because films are so there's so many people involved in films that they would not be created if there were not someone kind of like the cheerleader and mind at the same time who were holding it all together and moving it in a particular direction. They would not happen. They could not happen. It's just too insane. And I think with what you'll find is that most of the really good movies that get made, it's just something you can just observe, like going out into nature and just looking at things. Most of the good films that get made, the directors are the writers.
Yeah.
It's just a fact. There's tons of movies made, and normally the good ones have the same director and writer. And that wasn't the case in early golden era Hollywood.
Yeah.
But back then it was different because they were much less locked. Many of them were much less locked down to their scripts. The directors had much more control. There's famous stories about, if you go back and watch Howard Hawks films like Bringing Up Baby, or to Have and Have Not, or he was an incredible director.
Oh, I didn't know he directed both of those films. That is a weird cross section right there.
Yeah,
of films.
It certainly is.
Yeah. I actually had an argument.
El Dorado.
I had an argument with my wife today about whether or not Lauren Bacall has a man voice, because because she said that was the case, and I thought, no way.
Have and Have Not.
Yeah,
that is one of the sexiest films ever made.
It's great, dude. You ever been bit by a dead bee, dude? Oh, it's so good. Anyway, back to what you were saying. So he directing all these films, right? And you're saying he was not the script writer for any of these.
Right. What I'm saying though is that he didn't write the scripts for them. But what happened, for example, the story behind To Have and Have Not is hilarious, because actually the movie is amazing. Okay, I'll say that first. Watch it. But how it was made is that he was out on a fishing boat with Hemingway for a week. He would take these fishing trips. And so he was out there and kind of, I don't know how many drinks in they were or what, but he said, Hemingway, I'll take your worst story and turn it into a great film.
Yeah.
And Hemingway was like, oh, well, what's my worst story? And he said, you're a pretty good writer, but To Have and Have Not is trash.
Yeah.
And so he picked up the challenge. He went back and he followed the story for the first 15 minutes of the film. If you watch it, he follows the story and it's garbage. It's very, very boring. There's some kind of, revolution. I don't even remember, but there's some kind of revolution happening. You don't know what's going on.
No.
And then Howard Hawks had a crush on, he had found Lauren Bacall. She hadn't done a film before. She was very nervous. And he was kind of interested in her. And he also noticed that Humphrey Bogart was getting interested in her. And one part of him wanted to destroy the relationship because he wanted Bacall.
Yeah.
And the other part of him, which was the genius director, knew that he had to get what he was seeing on film.
Yeah.
And so in the film, Bogart was actually supposed to get together. In the story, he gets together with the other girl. But he just, every morning, they would show up, they would sit around with their cigarettes and whatever, before the film started running, and take the script for that day, and with the pencil just rewrite every line and add all sorts of innuendo, everything that they wanted in the movie, just based on what they were feeling. And then they would go out in front of the cameras and shoot it. That's how that movie was made. And Hitchcock did never make movies that way. But no, he was there months before with tape down on the floor and said, yeah, I don't care what you're feeling. You're going to give me this shot right here.
Yeah. Actually, that's the story behind John Carpenter's Big Trouble in Little China.
Is it true?
Yeah, is the worst script they could find. John Carpenter took the worst script he could find. It
gives you amazing freedom to do that, though, as a director.
Yeah,
because nobody really cares. They're like, do whatever.
Yeah, you feel so free.
You turn it into a comedy, or like you take the piss with it because you can.
There's a great French director who they were doing a lot of thinking about films in the 60s. One of my very favorite
directors. They were doing
directors.
a lot else as well.
They were doing a lot in the 60s.
In France?
Well, yeah. So he has this great quote about film, because there's so much different. There's a perennial, like, what is film? There's so many, like, it's actually one of those questions that you think you know what it is until you start to ask what it is, and then it's some people would say it's storytelling, like Howard Hawks. It's being a good storyteller. And then there's innumerable directors who are on the other side who don't think it has anything to do with storytelling, even something that basic. And so they were asking, like, well, do you need a scripted, like, what's necessary for a film? And Eric Romer has this quote where he says, to shoot a film is to shoot something. It sounds like, okay, duh. But he's being serious, because he was a writer too, and he had written novels before, and he made films on both sides. He would write the short stories before, and then sometimes he would come in with just a very loose idea and a premise and start to shoot and develop the film out of the characters. Yeah. And both films that you watch by him are incredible, and they have his mark on them somehow. But you just have to have something. You just have to have something. I'm sure. I'm not deliberately, but I'm sure that a podcast has to be like that, in some ways, right? Where you can make a podcast, and sometimes you can do it very scriptedly, and sometimes you can do it very loosely, but you have to have something that you're starting with to move from.
Yeah, you have to have a premise or a basic structure or something like that.
Otherwise, you have nothing to hang anything on.
Yes, exactly. And then you get the kind of shows where it's just guys eating pretzels in a circle.
Then it's not a podcast.
That's not a podcast. That's just a conversation. That is kind of funny, because when you think about film, you can have one medium that it can include, like, Terrence Malick, Harmony Korine, and Michael Bay. Yes. and somehow that's all something under the same umbrella that we all kind of agree is a thing. What's funny about that, though, is that in the age of the internet, now that we've democratized everything, we've sort of created subsectors and things that we don't consider film, like the YouTube video. You know what I mean? Where
we know that there are things that aren't filmed.
Yeah,
right? we know when we see it, it's right. It's not just having audio and visual.
Yes, it's content. Okay, well, what does that mean?
Yes.
And like, what makes film different? Well, I guess there's a certain language that's included, and then there's things that blur those lines. It gets
I think
tougher and tougher.
The thing that makes it the hardest to delineate is the documentary film and the narrative film, right? Because one could argue that the documentary, what's essential to it is the cutting into a narrative, but forget the name of the director and no, I think it might have been, was it Andy Warhol who did this? The film that was
Manhattan.
Just a shot of the
It's
Empire
not called
State
Manhattan.
Building.
What's it called?
Just a shot of the Empire State Building for a full 24 hours or something like
it's
that.
like 6
Yes,
or
that's
7
it.
hours, I think.
Yeah.
What's that called? It's not Manhattan. What's it called?
Dude, I don't know.
Okay. Is it like? I think it might be called Empire.
Yeah, something like that.
That sounds right.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Let's check that box.
One of the funniest things about that, I was watching a video about that movie, and somebody said that there's sort of this school of criticism that claims that there's a moment in the movie where they switch the film. They run out of film and they switch the film, and it creates a flicker, and they're like, "That's it. That is the thesis statement. The flicker. This is actually about
Very
the
Warhol-esque.
souls of the New Yorkers who died constructing this thing, or the concrete prison that is New York, right?" And it's like, wow, okay,
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, you can. I don't know. I don't know if that's exactly what he intended, but
Yeah, I mean, but that's the thing is like, one could argue that the YouTube commentary channel talking about Uber Eats could also is in a way constructed into narrative. But that's closer to news. Like I can't. It's hard to delineate it to that level. It's almost. It feels arbitrary sometimes, but it is, as you said. It when you see it. It's an instinct thing.
I would actually disagree with you. I don't think that's the biggest separation, because I think when you talk to the really good documentary directors, I mean, Werner Herzog is the most famous. He's pretty clear on that. For him, there's a very soft line between documentary and film. And you watch his early films. I just watched Aguirre Day of Wrath recently, and it already feels like you feel like you're in the Amazon with him because he's filming it there or wherever he was filming it. But I think that good documentary directors still, when they're making the movies, the good ones make it as films. They know when someone's looking into the camera and when someone's not, and they wait. If there's someone who's the serial killer and you don't know who he is yet in the documentary, they will draw you into his character deliberately by having him alone look into the camera for the first 40 minutes of the film, and then you figure out that this character who you have been made close to is the one who did it. I think that the good ones see like the art,
the language of film. And that it's the language of the visual medium and the tools that you have for that.
You say that, the good ones, but would you categorize the movie that we are calling Empire as a documentary, or what would you say it is? Just a visual piece?
I got to look this up.
It's an art film.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's not what it is. It's not a documentary.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you are 100% correct.
I gotta figure this out. Just give me a second. Yeah, it's called Empire. I was right.
Oh, damn!
I was right.
Called the shot, dude.
Well,
Called the
I called the shot. Yeah.
Goodness. Anything.
No, I think the thing that's more perplexing is there is an art director who made. I mean, you could call them. I don't know if you call them feature films, but his name's Andrei Tarkovsky, and you'll go on great film lists and you'll see Alfred Hitchcock on that list, and then Andrei Tarkovsky, and they'll be right up next to the top.
And what does Andrei Rublev have in common with Psycho?
Yes, exactly. It's difficult to they both were also theorists of film, and when you hear them talk about what they believe film is, it's completely different.
Yeah.
And yet we both know. We see them. I mean, maybe some people would watch a Tarkovsky and see him film and say this isn't a film.
Yeah,
and that's fair enough. They're pretty,
I mean, I legitimately think that the Bell vignette in Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev is maybe like 20 minutes of like the greatest, some of the greatest 20 minutes in film history. I mean, it's amazing. It's a perfect narrative. Like 20 minutes later where it's just a bunch of naked cultists running in the woods, like that's when it just becomes where, that's where the line gets a little wavy.
Yes, I don't know why I'm here still.
Yeah.
I have other things to do.
Yeah, exactly. That was one of the first movies my wife and I watched together, because I'm a Russian history guy, and that's like that was my focus in college, was Russian history. And she was like, "Oh, well, we should watch this movie. I've heard great things." And it was 4 hours later. And I was like,
hey, if you want a long date, it's an easy way to get.
Yeah, exactly.
You have to find other things to do with each other.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, I know this the whole time. It was just firmly, my chin in my fingers, just looking at the screen, being like, "What does the balloon represent?
Yes.
Why are they flying around?" I was really thinking hard. That's what I was up to when I was watching that movie.
Of course. Oh, goodness.
Yeah.
Interesting.
No, so I think that you got me thinking when you said like, what is it about film? How do I convert? And normally if I convert people, it's the way that I do it. I just start talking about whatever they like. That's the only, like, you start wherever you are. And also say, like, when you said the blockbuster, it's a big film. For me, my perspective, I'm an omnivore.
Yeah.
Like they say, like the dinosaurs, different dinosaurs. I'm in that category of the dinosaur that I like all of the foods. Anything. And that's what I think that most people are missing in film, is that they hear me talk and they think, oh, he's like a cinephile, right?
Yeah.
Or some kind of he doesn't watch movies the same way. And it's not that I have like special interests. It's just that I like everything. I'm not prejudiced towards the movies that have been made in the past 10 years.
Yeah.
There's movies, when I see film, it's a huge swath of films from 100 years or more now of films, and there's and we don't want to limit ourselves to a particular category. I think that's very akin to the idea of like what they did at Hillsdale College with academics, is like, you just want to be an omnivore. I think ideally you're not like a classicist or like a canonist or like we only read old stuff. It's just that there's the palate's kind of redundant most of the time. If you're not deliberate about expanding the palate, the flavors are pretty. It's just like eating hot dogs constantly, and you don't know that there's anything other than the hot dog. You're just like, let's just open up and try some other foods here. I think it's the same thing with the films that I watch. Is I just like a lot of different kinds.
I feel like one thing that's pretty consistent about film discourse right now, at least online, right, in places like Twitter or Letterboxd or whatnot, is that it's very hot dog centric. It's very, people get into their hot dog and they're very much militant about their hot dog, whatever it is. I feel like every 4 or 5 months Scorsese will be dragged out and be like, Marvel movies bad, and then of course it's very embarrassing for the Marvel people because they make absolute fools of themselves, being like, "What? You made 5 mob movies, you idiot!" It's like, they're more than just 5 mob movies. They're Scorsese movies.
Yes,
and it's very like. And then on the other side, actually, I won't say a good thing really about Marvel movies. So I don't know if this is a good example, but
No, I understand, but there's
an exclusionary nature.
Everyone agrees that there are great superhero films, though.
Yeah.
Like maybe some of the recent ones have been done poorly.
Yeah.
Or they're not living up to what good films could be. But I think it'd be foolish to say you couldn't make a really great Marvel movie. And some of them, and look, we have some really great ones right now. Spider-Man and the Spider-Verse is everyone agrees that that's great, and that's pop. Everybody likes that.
Yeah, everybody. There isn't a single person who dislikes it.
Are there people? I haven't met people. I say that because I haven't met anyone.
Come forth.
Yeah, exactly.
My 3 or 4 year old brother was. I mean, I loved it when I watched it, and he talk about monomania.
Yeah,
no, yeah.
He believed he was Spider-Man. I just saw a video of him. Someone asked him what his name was, and he said Miles.
Incredible.
I am Miles Morales.
I am Miles.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
That could be problematic.
So what do you think about animation then? Actually, that's a good segue. What do you think about animation?
I love it.
But would you say
you're an omnivore? But
the big thing of people arguing about right now is whether or not animation should be more brought into the best picture conversation, right? Because it's very infrequently added in. Like, would you say, and would you have liked to have seen Into the Spider-Verse, the first one, put into the best picture nomination?
Well, I don't know what else was on the docket.
It wasn't a great year, if I remember correctly. But do you think that there is enough distinction in the art form that it should not be considered as such? I mean, I personally don't believe. I personally believe that it should be in the consideration because of how general the category is. But what's your instinct on it?
Yeah, my favorite. I mean, being someone who likes film, you're not going to be surprised to know that my favorite animator ever is Hayao Miyazaki.
Yeah, which I actually watched a handful of Miyazaki films the other week, so I'd be happy to talk about those. But continue your thought.
And I think that he said something very interesting about animation. Unsurprisingly, he's not a big fan of anime. But what he says about animation is he says very clearly in one interview, animation is for children. And I thought, my God, Hayao Miyazaki is saying that animation is for children? Because if there's anybody that in Roger Ebert's article on Spirited Away, he says the thing that everybody says in these, that everyone says that animation's for children, but here is this great director who's these are films for adults, just as well as children. And so then you think, well, why is it that someone who is explicitly making movies, who says he's making movies for children, is suddenly, when the movies come out, everyone is saying that they're for adults? But I agree with Miyazaki. I think that, I mean, I don't think Miyazaki has any problem with adults loving his movies, but I think it's precisely because he understands that animation is for children that he's able to make movies that are of the caliber. Because I mean, because he also says that he thinks a lot of this Japanese animator says that he described Western animated films as, quote, weird. By which he means something very simple, which is what kind of, this isn't humanity that they're presenting in these movies. You watch little kids when you're on the airplane with the kids with the iPads in front of them looking at their things, and it's not human. What the characters on there are not, they don't behave like human beings. They don't think like human beings. There's nothing human about them. They're weird. And of course, for most Westerners, I mean, every Westerner has to be convinced at some point, me included, that isn't that anime? Isn't that kind of strange? I mean, maybe not anymore because everybody watches anime now. But I'm
curious what he would think. I wonder what he said about Akira when it came out.
I don't know.
I don't know. That is a good question, because I mean, in my mind, that's like it would be a good similar example of like, oh, this is a movie. Yeah, this is a real movie.
But that's an adult's film, right? Yeah. Everyone knows that that's an adult's.
That's an adult's film. So I'm curious what he would have said.
He probably wouldn't. He probably
it.
Doesn't like it very much.
Yeah. Well, so I wanted to also.
I don't like
ask,
it very much either. But
I
can't.
To bring the conversation back to.
Actually, real quick, just 2018. When Into the Spider-Verse came out.
This is actually
was when Green Book won the Best Picture.
Oh no!
So it was Green Book, Black Panther. Black Klansman, Bohemian Rhapsody, which, I mean, definitely should not have been on that list.
No.
The Favorite, Roma, A Star Is Born.
Roma is, that shouldn't have definitely.
A Star Is Born and Vice.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I cannot believe Rami Malek won Best Actor that year. That is
that movie is
insane.
Atrocious. It is one of the, you've probably seen that video of the editing job on it.
No.
Of the one scene. There's a scene where they're all sitting down. And it's like supposed to be semi-dramatic, but they're sitting down at lunch, and like one of their agents comes up and is like, "Hey, they're not going to shoot the music video," or something like that. And there is, no joke, 25 cuts in like 5 seconds. It's crazy. Just cut. Every line, every possible noise is just cut. It breaks the 180 rule a couple of times. It's just it's out of control. It's a bad movie. Go ahead.
So what I was saying is, we were talking about Best Picture. So you were saying, animation potentially is for children, right? Would you say that there are films for children that should be considered for Best Picture?
Yes, that's the natural next question, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, why wouldn't you? I mean, we make all movies are for someone.
Yeah.
Right.
True.
I mean, you're like it's just. I mean, in some sense, film is like any other form of communication, and you're someone making something for someone else, and it can never just be for everybody. Because that's not someone. And so I don't know, like, when have we ever drawn, I mean, I suppose we have drawn lines about that sometimes, but I don't see any reason why something that was made for children shouldn't be considered as greatest film.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would just have to be special. And I guess it wouldn't have to be like the way that Miyazaki describes Western animation. It couldn't be weird. You know what I mean? Because like when you...
but what she means is it has to be humane. It has to be human. Yeah. That's all.
And like the way that when you say that, I'm just thinking about Spirited Away because I watched Spirited Away and Howl's Moving Castle back to back a couple of weeks ago. And I was just really struck by how much the protagonist in Spirited Away cries in like a real way. You know what I mean? Like feeling very powerless. And like there might be a scene like that at a low point in a movie.
Yeah.
Made in the West, but I think that a Western protagonist is very capable and very much in control. Right. And at the low point of the movie, they might have like, I can't believe everything's falling apart. And then they kind of come back. But like in that movie, it's very much, there's a lot of weakness. There's a lot of, this is a little girl.
Yes.
You know, It is very human.
It doesn't happen anymore.
I wish it was paced differently.
It used to happen though a lot in animation. If you go back and watch the old Cinderella
Yeah.
and the old Sleeping Beauty and most of those old Disney princess movies, there's almost always a point in the movie when at the low point when the heroine starts to cry, and then a fairy godmother shows up or something like this, and then things come. I mean, it's explicitly what happens in Cinderella. If you remember that she goes back into the garden, her dress has been torn apart. She goes down, she lays down on the bench, and then she starts to cry.
Yeah,
and then and that's biblical. I mean, for me, that's Hagar. Hagar. It happens over and over. Like that. If you read Genesis, that's basically every story in Genesis. I mean, you could say, oh, it's weakness. The heroine's weak. My dad once watched one of these actually, and said he said, "What is the moral of the Disney princess movies? That like you just start to cry and things will get solved." And all I can say is that's the moral of Genesis.
Damn,
Just to quite for the right people.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's I hadn't really thought about that before. Yeah,
but I agree with you. It is very unusual nowadays, though, to see a protagonist in a children's film cry.
Yeah, I feel like everybody's very capable.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
The protagonist is very capable, and
or at the very least, like a very popular theme right now is to be taught humility, right?
yeah,
There's humility is not something that is usually within a protagonist of an animated film to begin with. They usually have to be brought low.
Yeah.
But then brought low in a way that's not like
that's self-actualizing.
I'm incapable. It's more of like other people can also be good people, right? Like that's usually how it's sort of framed.
Yeah.
Not a lot of self-change.
Yeah. What is it that you like about Miyazaki other than that?
good Lord.
I mean, facial hair for me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the visual work is masterful, right?
Yes.
You know,
his food, the way he shoots food,
the way he shoots food,
draws food.
Yeah.
Yes. I think that I was good friends. One of those two guys that I was mentioning at the beginning of the podcast. They introduced us to a lot of Miyazaki as well, and one of them works at the Botanical Gardens in Chicago, and we were watching one of his movies, and he pointed out afterwards. He said, do you know that every plant in a Miyazaki movie is a real plant? And Miyazaki, I mean, you've watched Pokemon. It's just a green blur in the forest background. But Miyazaki films, in a lot of his films take place in forests and woods and things like this. And they're not just one kind of tree that's in the background. If you pay attention, every plant is you could identify it. And I think that basic that disposition is represented everywhere in his movies. And I think that I shouted down Ebert earlier on for what he said about Miyazaki, but I actually think that he's exactly on the mark on this point. Actually, in the center of Spirited Away is that the word that he says that he describes it, I think, is hospitality.
Yeah,
and by that he means that or generosity. And there's this, there's the movie, but then there's infinitely extra that he's giving you. That's real reality that he's representing. The way that he, if you watch interviews with him when he's making some of his later movies about Japan in the 1920s, or about the guy who made the Japanese Zero plane, you can see interviews when he gathers up the whole studio who's helping to animate and shows them, look, when people bow now, they bow and then they pop back up, but there was an attitude of humility and reverence towards one another in 1920s Japan, or 1930s, whenever, and they bowed like this. They bowed all the way, and then they didn't come quite back all the way up. They kind of stayed like this, and the conversation was conducted in that kind of attitude. And so I need you to change your animation to take account of this, because you're not animating this correctly. And I think that's one of the remarkable things in his whole way of presenting movies, is that he has an attitude of reverence towards reality. And then there's a spirit of hospitality or generosity that shows up, that he's giving you extra things like the lamp that bounces in front of them and leads back.
Yeah.
He's always giving more. And that's the feeling of that created world. That's why people, I mean, that's the danger of it. I mean, he was very afraid that his movies were doing damage, because people would want to live in them or exit reality for them. But for him, they were supposed to be redirected.
I'm
back.
curious how that applies, you think, to the conceit. Like I remember I had not seen Spirited Away before, and I remember people saying like, "Oh, it's actually a sex trafficking allegory, and all these things." And then I watched it, I was like, "This is too generous. Like, it's too much of a good. Like, there's fraughtness to what people are experiencing.
Yes,
but it's it's too comfortable.
Yes.
I feel like it's just reading too much negativity into it. Like trying to terrify, because it's a scary-ish kind of world, but it's not terrifying.
Yes.
Right? It's not something that's going to make a child, want to leave the theater in any respect. Outside of maybe like that scene where No Face goes on a rampage or whatever. But I was watching it, I was like, no, I don't think I agree with that. I don't think that's an accurate portrayal of it.
Well, and there's reasons for it too, in the because of how he makes the movies, why they would turn out this way. It's kind of like I don't know. When I heard it, I didn't really get why it was so unique. But it is. You can't, and you couldn't make movies this way with live action, or you can't. I mentioned. I'll just say what it is. He instead of storyboarding the film prior to making it, and then going and doing the animation and filling it out, you can see him. He's in a big room with all of his animators, and as they're making the movie, he's working on the storyboard. And so wherever they are in the movie, they're all together at the same point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
they're all together at the same point in the movie, and they don't know.
Yeah,
and you can see him when they're close to finishing the movie, making fundamental decisions about how the movie ends. He doesn't know how it's going to end. It's coming out of him, and he's working with it, and it's difficult, a difficult process. And so he's kind of giving birth to it, and they're all helping him give birth to it as it's coming out. And so because of that, that disposition of hospitality or extraness comes naturally, right? Because every moment is valuable in itself, and I think that's reality.
I think that comes across in the pacing.
Yes,
for sure.
Certainly,
there are moments where you feel like he spends, I would say, at least in my assumption, in that moment, like just too much time on a thing, and it's like, oh, he's in it. He's in that moment. He's doing it. It's like the scene when she's going down those stairs on the outside of the bathhouse. I was like, why are we here? Why are we doing this? I mean,
or the famous one, right, is on the train when she's leaving, and there's all of the ghost shadow people on the train, and they're just going, and you hear the rhythm of you look out at the waves, and you hear the rhythm of the train, and it just stays there for a while, and you kind of digest the insanity that's happening in the film.
Yeah. Well, this is a really great conversation. I think we have to get to the Patreon question. I think we've actually hit an hour.
Yeah, we gotta roll. Could you double check the time while I read off the Patreon question?
Yeah. Well, we'll lightning round this section. Well, maybe we can answer them more extensively in the Patreon. If you wish to stay for the Patreon, of course,
if you'd like to.
I think this was rolling for like 5 or 6 minutes before we got there, and it's at 1:02.
Wow.
So,
okay. Incredible. Yeah. Well, we just crushed this, guys.
Well, Sam,
you just roll through it.
You've been doing a really great job. Thank you for being here so far,
guys. We could not we could not do this podcast if it was not for our Patreon supporters. It's just that simple, guys. The reason we have this space.
I have a baby at home. I would not be here if you weren't paying me.
So I mean, there you go. So keep doing it, or else who knows? Regardless, so I want to thank our top patrons first and foremost, that being Luke Robson, Zach and Amber Strehle, Sammy Roberts, and Joe Papalardo. Thank you especially for your guys' help here. And if you guys are interested, we've got a lot of stuff you guys can get on the Patreon, Patreon/Monomaniacs pod. In addition, we've got our Patreon post show, as we mentioned earlier. It's $5. You could get access to over 60 hours of content for $5. That's a pretty good deal. I'm just going to throw that out there. And at the $10 tier, you can ask us questions that we will answer on the pod. For some reason, my Discord app continues to crash every time I open it.
Right here.
So if you've got that open, that would be very, very helpful.
Joe Papalardo. Okay, so these ones are all for Sam. So we're going to have you answer them in a relatively rapid fire method because he sent them in a very rapid fire method. Okay, so don't think too much. I know that you like to be diligent about what you say. Mm-hmm. Just go into it. For me. Okay, Sam, do you regret anything?
Yes.
Okay.
Great
What
answer.
is the best description from an exterior observer of you dancing? I think he has memories that are associated with this.
I've been told that I look like one of those balloons in front of where they sell cars and things like this. That where the air comes up and it flops down.
So joyous.
Boneless. Would be as actually the descriptor. Worm-like, boneless.
A noodle man. Worm boy.
Yes, worm boy, precisely.
Yes. Okay, best fluid to get drunk on.
Tequila.
Okay,
that is an unpopular opinion.
Yeah,
incredible.
I mean, effective, but
yes,
it's a rough next day. Speaking of which, best way to cure a hangover.
Raw eggs.
Okay.
Have you ever tried that? Have you done that?
Yes. It's
okay. It seems to work for you. All right, and finally, favorite prayer.
Oh goodness. My favorite prayer is right now it's a prayer by Saint Teresa of Avila, and she says I could pull it up and I'm not going to get it quite right, but
Yeah.
she says what God is everywhere. Maybe you give me a moment and I can pull it
Yeah,
up.
feel free. Feel free. It's not like I have a baby at home.
So what about those Bears, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, great season coming up.
Defense falling apart.
Oh, yeah. Terrible.
He actually might have something to say about the Bears. He's from Chicago. I don't know if you do.
I wanted to say this is just an embarrassing tale.
Yeah.
On the way here, I saw a dead deer on the road.
Yeah.
And the first thing that popped to my mind, and I literally audibly spoke this aloud. I said, "What's that kangaroo doing there? What am I smoking?" Anyway, you seem to have found the prayer.
Yeah.
No, I didn't find it, but I know the most important line in it though is that all things are passing, God endures forever. Patient endurance attains all things. And that's the line is patient endurance attains all things from Saint Teresa of Avila. That it's been like that's it, man.
Nice. Well, that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for being on the show. It was a real pleasure. Do you have anything you want to plug?
No, I have nothing I want to plug.
Okay, sounds good. Well,
there's a screenplay about a sexless couple that's coming to Hollywood soon. So
trust me, there's plenty of screenplays about a sexless couple that are languishing in the submission box. All right, see you guys.
Bye.